Today I welcome back Dr. Edmund Storms. Dr. Storms is a nuclear chemist who spent 34 years working at Los Alamos National Labs. There he conducted research into materials for use in nuclear power and propulsion reactors, including studies of cold fusion. He's the author of The Science of Low-Energy Nuclear Reaction, published in 2007, and has recently published a follow-up book exploring the theoretical side of LENR. Ed, thanks for once again agreeing to sit down with me today.
Well, thank you, John. It's a pleasure.
So, just in case anyone is joining us for the first time and missed our first interview together, can you briefly explain your background and entry into the field of cold fusion?
Well, I was working at the Los Alamos National Lab doing studies of materials involved in space propulsion, nuclear space propulsion, when Pons and Fleischmann made their announcement. That announcement was really exciting to the people at Los Alamos, because if they were correct, if that source of energy actually existed, then much of the difficulties that Los Alamos had in supplying power for spacecraft and for space propulsion would go away. And so a lot of people at the laboratory put aside what they were doing and set about trying to replicate what Pons and Fleischmann were claiming. In my case, I was working in a group where many of the world's experts in tritium detection were working. And so it seemed natural that we would try to make tritium by the cold fusion technique, which we did. We were successful. It wasn't a lot of success. I mean, we ran over 200 different combinations of materials using the electrolytic technique and got 13 samples to produce tritium at levels that could not be accounted for any other way. And that work was later published in a peer-reviewed journal. Our work was one of the few successes at Los Alamos, and because of that, Los Alamos, the people higher up in the laboratory, particularly those who follow the dictates of the DOE, were not convinced. But I was convinced, and my group leader was convinced, and people who actually saw it work were convinced. But when I left the laboratory, I then built a laboratory here in Santa Fe next to my home, where I continued the study.
As I just mentioned, you recently wrote a new book titled The Explanation of Low-Energy Nuclear Reaction. What is the book's overall thesis, and what do you hope to accomplish by writing it? And specifically, how is it different from your first book on LENR, published in 2007?
The first book was basically a summary of all the experimental work that was done prior to 2007. The goal was to try to bring all that together into one place, try to make sense of it, try to show the errors and what were errors and what were not errors, in order to convince people that the phenomena was real. It failed to do that. It only sold 1,000 copies, and it obviously did not change the minds that mattered. I continued my work trying to replicate the effect, and in order to do that, you have to understand something about how it works. You can do just random experiments, but the most effective ones are guided by some kind of basic understanding. In order to achieve that understanding, I read all the various theories, and I was appalled at the conflicts between what is actually known in the field and the conflicts with natural law that were implicit in these theories. And I found that none of them were successful in guiding my work. So out of desperation, I said, okay, obviously the only way I'm going to get a better theory is to make one myself. So I set about trying to understand what a theory had to explain and how the various theories that already were proposed were flawed, and set about writing a book that would put this in a context that made it possible for ordinary people to understand what cold fusion was all about. And I had done this in various papers and talks, but those have such a limitation in the time and the number of pages that I could not explain the full breadth of the field of the phenomena using that technique. So it became clear that writing a book where there is no page limit would be the only way of doing this effectively, and so the second book resulted.
So the overall thesis is an assessment of theory, right? And a presentation of your theory, or is it a mix of those two things?
My theory is not a mixture of other theories, except, one of the things about cold fusion, there are certain features that have to be taken into account, and the various theories address those features in different ways. For example, there has to be a special place in the material that can support the nuclear reaction. People make different choices as to where that is. The hydrogen atoms have to come together in order to fuse. They can't be isolated as they normally are in a lattice. They have to somehow or another form a cluster, and the various theories provide different ways for that to happen. So, yes, my theory has features in it that are identical sometimes to other theories, but my theory puts all of the features that a theory has to address together into one theory, rather than just simply having an explanation of a selected group of observations. I try to create a theory that explains absolutely everything, all the observations that have been made so far about how process function and the results of the nuclear reaction. And I try to do this without making a conflict with any known law of nature. And that's the other problem with the other theories. Most of them have basic conflicts with the law of thermodynamics. And I consider that, as a chemist, I consider that an absolute no-no. The laws of thermodynamics are probably some of the most thoroughly documented, thoroughly supported, and thoroughly accepted laws known to man. And you don't ignore them without very, very good reason. And most of the theories ignore these laws.
Before we jump further into theory, experiment is often what informs theory to begin with, and then theory can inform experiment and so on. So it forms this kind of loop. So it's been about 7 years since you last wrote the book, and that largely focused on experimental work. So what do you think has been the most compelling developments experimentally in the field since you wrote your last book? And have you explored these subjects at all in the new book?
Well, the most spectacular work has been done by Imamura at Mitsubishi in Japan. They've been exploring one of the transmutation reactions. There's two separate independent transmutation reactions that produce different transmutation products, and they explored one of those very, very thoroughly. And the other transmutation type reaction also has been explored, but not as thoroughly. The question, of course, is what's the difference between the two, and how can you explain them in terms of the cold fusion reaction? None of the theories had successfully done that. And so that was a new approach that I chose. There's also quite a bit of additional information about radiation being emitted. Initially, radiation wasn't seen because it wasn't looked for, and that created a bit of a problem as how the energy is being dissipated, and people came up with all kinds of ideas as to why that would be true. But as people looked more carefully, they did in fact find the radiation, and that radiation gives tremendous insight as to what's going on within the nuclear process. So that was new information. And then there's been periodic additional excess energy produced. The group Energetics using superwave were particularly successful in recent times in producing large amounts of excess energy using the Pons-Fleischmann electrolytic technique. And then finally, there's Andrea Rossi, who had discovered recently a way of creating active nickel that is capable of producing large amounts of heat. And his efforts to commercialize that and to get people's attention for possible commercialization created a tremendous incentive to try to figure out what's going on, because once he showed that these reactions could in fact be caused to occur at very high rates and produce very large amounts of energy, that opened the door to commercialization. And that door is still open, and people are trying to go through it, unfortunately without proper understanding.
We've alluded to it a bit already and talked about it a little bit already, but now can you begin to explain to us in a general sense your what's called resonant hydroton theory? What led you to it, generally speaking? How can it account for what we observe in a variety of cold fusion systems as well?
That's a difficult question to answer. That's the reason I wrote the book. So if you want a good answer, you're going to have to buy the book. I can tell you that there are certain assumptions that I make in the process of getting to the conclusion that a hydroton is required. The hydroton is just simply a made-up word to describe a structure of hydrogen that forms within a gap. It's not in the lattice itself, it's only in cracks. And these cracks have been seen to form, but the cracks that are active are very, very small cracks. That is, they have a very small gap width. That gap width is 2 to see with normal scanning electron microscopes. But the larger cracks have been seen, and of course where you have large cracks, you have small cracks as well. But anyway, the issue is that there has to be a special environment, and within that special environment, there has to be a structure formed containing hydrogen that is able to overcome the Coulomb barrier by some process and then dissipate the energy. And the hydroton is the structure that I propose does that. That's where all the magic of cold fusion lies. That's the unique discovery of cold fusion. The rest of the process mostly has to do with normal chemical behavior of the lattice itself in being able to deliver hydrogen to the gap and make it available for the hydroton to form. So we have two separate processes going on in cold fusion that have frequently been mixed together by other theory. We have a chemical, normal, ordinary, nothing special chemical process taking place within the lattice. And then we have a special chemical structure forming within a particular characteristic of the material, which I identify as being cracks, that initiate the nuclear reaction. And most of the theories have focused only on the nuclear reaction occurring in the lattice itself. If you try to do that, you automatically get in conflict with laws of thermodynamics. I move it out of the lattice into the crack where the laws of thermodynamics do not apply. So the theory is a mixture of many different concepts, many different requirements, many different interactions, but each one is identified separately and the interrelationship is shown, and that interrelationship is consistent with everything that has been so far observed when cold fusion is initiated. So that's the goal of any theory, to try to explain as large a collection of observation as possible. And that's what this particular theory does.
So at this moment, what do you think might be the best way to engineer the nuclear active environment? In this case, Nano-Cracks. And if we're having a hydroton structure form within those cracks, it's not an ordinary structure. It must be the result of some kind of phase transition or something like that. And you equate it to metallic hydrogen. So how does that exactly fit into your theory, and why do you think metallic hydrogen specifically applies to LENR?
Well, metallic hydrogen is a form of hydrogen that was predicted theoretically back in 1935. And it is predicted to result if hydrogen is put under very high pressure. That high pressure brings the nuclei closer together. It forces the electrons into a different energy state. And the presumption was that it would produce a superconductor and it would act as a metal under those conditions. And then later in 1991, Horowitz came to the conclusion that that structure would probably support a fusion reaction. I mean, after Pons and Fleischmann pointed out that that was happening in palladium, the natural conclusion was, okay, if you can force hydrogen close enough using high pressure, perhaps you can achieve the fusion reaction that way, just like brute force, essentially. Well, hydrogen has a very limited possible electron interaction. I mean, there's only one electron involved with each nucleus. So the number of energy states is very, very limited. And hydrogen is one of the more well-known electron states. If I were going to form a particular structure that had the capability that I propose the hydroton has, I almost have to access the same electron state that would be creating metallic hydrogen. So there's a natural relationship between the two. On the one hand, people have proposed that metallic hydrogen can initiate a nuclear reaction. I'm saying that I can create something that has the characteristics to do precisely that within cracks, and so therefore it has the characteristic of metallic hydrogen.
Again, how do you think you can engineer these cracks? Certain materials are more conducive to others in terms of forming the geometries that you would prefer. But what have you noticed from either your experiments or the body of work that you've analyzed that suggests that we can actually engineer these things and initiate the reaction by creating them?
Well, the cracks are created under normal conditions by stress relief. They're created in a totally prosaic, ordinary way. Now, cracks don't like to stay small. They either will grow bigger as the stress is relieved, or if the stress is not sufficient, they will heal and go back to a solid state. And that's the reason why cold fusion is so difficult to reproduce, because getting the crack to precisely the right size and having it stay at that size is very, very difficult. And it's purely a matter of luck. When a situations. One where you can try to make the gap size by chance, by creating the right stress and the right material. And there are recipes for doing that. People have gradually been able to create material that is more successful in initiating the cold fusion reaction than has been the case in the past. And so obviously you can, in fact, improve the ability of material to create exactly the right structure. And of course, the other way is to nanomachine the gaps into a material. That's very difficult at this point. The gaps are so small that people are not capable of making gaps that small yet. But that's a natural direction to go. But right now, people are most likely to have success by engineering materials to, when they're subjected to the right recipe, create the right crack structure.
Now, what do you think is the best evidence suggesting that the reaction takes place on the surface and also takes place in the cracks? Are you finding reaction products in those areas, or is it something else that suggests them?
Well, there's a number of pieces of evidence for that. First of all, the reaction products are found there. For example, the helium. In order for the helium to be detected in the gas outside the solid, it must have been produced very, very close to the surface. If it's produced anywhere deeper than a few microns, it will not be released into the gas. The same thing is true of tritium. The tritium is produced at the surface, very close to the surface. If it were produced deeper in, it also would not be released the same way. The transmutation products are all seen on the surface in particular sites. When people have looked at an active surface with IR cameras, they see flashes of heated areas showing that right at the surface, active heat production is taking place. And it's not steady. It flashes off and on. And of course, the heat that you measure is the average of millions of these things turning on and off. But all of that has to happen very near the surface, otherwise it would not be visible. So the evidence is overwhelming that this is a phenomena associated with the surface.
This might be a more subtle question, but you had the palladium black work of Arata, and that was replicated by McCoubry. And I think that's been pointed to as evidence for reactions in the bulk material, which is, again, the rest of the lattice. There's the surface and there's the bulk. So what accounts for that?
Well, palladium black is palladium having a very, very small size in the nanometer range of size. So it's all surface for all practical purposes. When we're talking about palladium black, we're talking about a surface. Each individual particle of palladium is incredibly small, and so for all practical purposes, there's only surface there. So I don't see the conflict.
So it doesn't really behave like bulk, in other words, because it more resembles a surface than a bulk material, because it's kind of loose particles, right?
That's right. The same is true of case material, where very finely divided palladium was deposited on carbon, and similar to an ordinary catalyst. That palladium is present in very finely divided form. Now, people have based their theories on the idea that the more the surface, the finer the particle, the more likely the cold fusion is to happen. That is not borne out by experimental observation, but that success using very finely divided material encouraged people to explore that particular path to try to increase the chances of it working. As far as I can tell, has not succeeded, but in any case, it suggested a particular line of exploration. My particular theory is suggesting a different line, that you don't have to have very finely divided material. In fact, that's actually not beneficial. Rossi, for example, has said that his material wants to be in the 10 micron range. Too small, it doesn't work. Too big, it doesn't work. So there's an ideal size. Well, that is also consistent with crack formation. A very finely divided material, such as a nanometer, will not crack because it can't build up enough stress to sever the bonds. And if it's too big, you can build up too much stress and the cracks will be too big. So there will be potentially an ideal particle size to get the exact correct size crack. Very possible that Rossi has discovered that.
Now, it might be a little confusing for people. I know it was for me. You have these nanoparticles, but in palladium systems, we have just kind of like the solid brick of material. It has some bulk to it. Sometimes it's just a thin film, but for the most part, it's kind of a larger material. But in Rossi and DGT, from what they've said, we have a core of nanoparticles. Are they just being pressurized in there, or are they mixed with some other material to give them a solid structure? Is it a type of matrix? What's going on in the core?
Well, one of the things that you have to take into account when you talk about bulk material is that if you look at the surface of these materials that actually turn out to be nuclear active, they're incredibly complex. I mean, under a scanning electron microscope, it looks like, the state of Utah. It looks like the Grand Canyon and the Canyon land. And so you really don't know how to call them a bulk material when we know it's happening in the surface and it's happening in that kind of environment. And that kind of environment is incredibly complex, having effective sizes all over the map. When you try to mix finely divided particle behavior with bulk behavior, you have to talk about it in the same terms as the atom sees. And when you look at it from the atom's point of view, they're essentially the same. The bulk material, the surface of it, is covered with nanostructures.
Now, is code deposition, does that fit into the puzzle for you? Because it seems that catalyzes the reaction in some way by helping to create a complex surface.
Yeah, the code deposition produces a very complex surface. And that complex surface very frequently, but not always, becomes nuclear active. I mean, code deposition works, but it doesn't work 100% of the time. It's like most of all aspects of cold fusion. It works enough to keep you interested, it keeps you working, but it doesn't work often enough to satisfy your need for a reproducible sample. But yes, the surface that is deposited is very complex, and you can put these surfaces down other ways. The co-deposition puts it down by the electrolytic technique. You can also apply it by sputtering. You can apply it by vaporization. The only issue is creating the necessary stress and weak spots within the surface. And it isn't just palladium. You can put down various things, and they will also work, various other elements.
All right, so transitioning a bit more back into your theory specifically and theory in general. You go through a lot of trouble in your book of emphasizing that any coherent theory must respect certain laws of nature, such as thermodynamics and those dictating chemical lattices. Why is this important in your view? And secondly, isn't it possible that a basic law is being violated in LENR systems, or some sort of novel effect is at play, even if it's unlikely?
Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, cold fusion LENR obviously has some features about it that are new, that people have not understood. There's obviously a new phenomena that is outside of our present understanding. But that does not say that that new feature is in conflict with what we already know. I mean, there's quite a difference between a new feature that conflicts with something or a new feature that adds to something. And I'm suggesting that cold fusion adds to what we know. It does not conflict with what we know. Now, if we take that point of view, then we know that the laws of thermodynamics are true and correct. I mean, modern chemistry could not function unless that were true. I mean, they are some of the most thoroughly supported laws that we know. So you don't want to propose an explanation that conflicts with those unless you have a really good reason. Furthermore, you don't want to find an explanation that conflicts with anything. You don't want it to conflict unless that's the only route that you can take for an explanation. So you should explore every other possibility that you can think of before you are forced into an explanation that conflicts with basic understanding. That has not been the case with the present theories. They've taken the easy route. They've tried to explain very limited observations while totally ignoring the laws of thermodynamics. And that's a bit a problem because a material such as palladium deuteride is a chemical structure to which the laws of thermodynamics apply without ambiguity. And so it's not a plasma. It's not like the situation in hot fusion where plasma can have all kinds of conditions that can in fact not be addressed very effectively by the laws of thermodynamics. Once you are in a chemical structure, the behavior has to be consistent with the laws of thermodynamics. The various theories, if you apply them to the lattice itself, you're forced into making them consistent with the laws of thermodynamics. That's almost impossible to do. That's why I felt the need to move out of the lattice into the crack, because once you move the mechanism out of the lattice, then a different set of laws apply. You don't have to worry about the laws of thermodynamics in quite the same way. It becomes much simpler, and you don't get the basic conflicts. But anyway, my basic message is, if you're going to explain cold fusion, start by not having them conflict with basic knowledge.
You also put forward the idea of a cluster, so you're not the only one to arrive at the idea of a certain cluster. Yours just happens to be this hydroton polymer-like chain that arranges itself in a linear defect. Other theorists like Takahashi, you have the tetrahedral symmetrical condensate, the BEC condensate, so you do have clusters in other models. What makes the hydroton model the most likely to arrange inside cracks? Because I know you've talked about Gibbs energy and how this is connected with this, and this is kind of a complicated and a nuanced topic, but is there any simple way that you can communicate that?
I'm trying to create a collection of hydrogen that have the ability to do several things. First of all, they have to have the ability to come together and get close enough so that they can have a nuclear interaction. And that means that you have to have some kind of bonding between them. I mean, you don't form a cluster in a chemical system or even in a crack without bonding being involved. That's the basic nature of chemistry, the basic nature of how atoms interact. They interact by bonding to one another through electron interaction. So I have to create a structure that has the ability to bond. Then it also has to have the ability to resonate, allowing the nuclei to get together periodically close enough that a nuclear interaction can occur. And then I have to be able to get that extra mass energy out of that system without producing excessive energetic radiation or destroying the system from which it's coming. In order to satisfy all those requirements, the simplest concept is to create a linear molecule bonded together by normal chemical bonds involving the p electron energy state. And the p electron energy state has the beauty that it has a figure 8 configuration, which allows essentially a string of hydrogen to form that normally does not form in ordinary chemical lattices because it takes too much energy. The gap allows that to form because of the nature of the gap, and I won't go into the details of that, but nevertheless, the gap forces the electron energy into that state. Once in that state, it allows this linear polymer, as you call it, to form, and once that forms, it becomes very straightforward for it to resonate. The uniqueness of that occurs when the two nuclei get periodically close together. Somehow or another, the two nuclei, before they actually touch each other or interact in the normal nuclear way, have to realize they have too much mass energy. And the only way they can get rid of that mass energy is to give off a photon. And each time they give off a photon, it takes a little bit of that energy away. All of it doesn't go away all at once, like in hot fusion. Because of the resonant process, the two nuclei immediately go apart, resonating in the other direction. And so the process is interrupted. That's the unique character of cold fusion. In hot fusion, the two nuclei come together and stay together, and they have to release their energy by the resulting nucleus exploding, and thereby carrying away the energy as kinetic energy. In the case of cold fusion, they come together periodically, emit photons that carry away the excess mass energy, until finally it's gotten rid of all the excess, in which case the two nuclei can come together, making the final product without the need for it to explode and carry away that extra energy. And so my predictions are that if you have deuterons in this hydroton, you will get hydrogen-4, which will decay by beta emission very, very rapidly to helium-4. If you have a proton and a deuteron, two isotopes of hydrogen, they will come together and form tritium. In the process, they take up the electron that's between them that's helping to overcome the Coulomb barrier. That forms tritium, which decays slowly, and slow enough that we can actually see it being produced. And finally, if you have two protons fusing together, you make deuterium, which is stable. So the theory accounts possible fusion reaction of all of the isotopes of hydrogen and predicts the consequence of those fusion reactions.
So two things real quick. The idea of a chain-like structure forming in a defect, I think, has more precedence than people realize. Even more recently, experiments with carbon nanotubes, they've been forming structures just like that in these small nanodomain regions and structures. So if these are kind of being recreated, not exactly nanotubes, but some kind of gap is being recreated in the environment, then it would make sense that these structures would form, because we already see that in certain things. And also with Rydberg atoms that you see in certain hot fusion experiments where you can see clusters forming at the interface between a material and the plasma. So there's precedent for clusters, and that makes a certain amount of sense. So it's not some kind of just like off-the-wall idea. The second thing is maybe you can better explain the idea of resonance, because I think when a lot of people think of resonance, you think of two tuning forks, you hit one, the other one starts vibrating at the same frequency. And this phenomenon we know is also going on to a degree in stars between nucleons. Fred Hoyle came up with the theory about it. But resonance is at play in fusion reactions. So how is that entered into? What does it mean when two nuclei are in resonance with each other? And what is that accomplishing?
Well, first of all, the process of resonance, you have essentially a bunch of positive charges that are held together by electrons in a linear fashion. And eventually they start vibrating all in unison so that two of them come together, and then of course the opposite two go further apart, and then at the next cycle the two that came together go further apart and the two that were further apart come together. So it's a resonance along the length. It's not a resonance like a violin string. It's a resonance by compression and rarefaction along the length. That's what you have to visualize. Now, when that happens, the presumption is that when the two nuclei come together at one part of the cycle, they know before they actually touch that they have too much mass energy for that distance. If they actually touch, if they come together and actually fuse at that point, you get hot fusion. And there's evidence under certain conditions that can happen. But in order to get cold fusion, you have to get rid of the energy piecemeal. You have to get it out of there, not in one big explosion, but over a period of time by small bits of it coming out. That's the critical nature of cold fusion. That's what makes it so unique. And so the question is, how does the nuclei know that it has to give off this energy as a photon? I mean, each nuclei that gets close together gives off one, and they go off in opposite directions to conserve momentum, and they go off along the line of the resonance in order to avoid creating spin components. And so you can make this work totally consistent with all known laws of nature in that context. The big question is, what interaction between the nuclei makes it possible for them to know that they have this extra mass energy? That's the big discovery. That's the unique thing about cold fusion. That's where the Nobel Prize is located, in identifying that process.
In hearing you describe the way it functions, the picture in my mind is of cuckoo clocks on a wall, and they start off randomly moving in opposite directions, but they eventually entrain each other, and they bring each other into a resonance where they're all going in the same directions and cooperating. And it's through this mechanism of rarefaction and mechanical communication between each other.
Well, if you take a spring, for example, that you can hang, let's say, something on at one end, and you attach the spring to a fixed area, and then you have the thing that is attached to the spring start bouncing up and down. So the spring goes together, and then the spring goes apart. If you imagine the nuclei being an arbitrary place on the wire of the spring, and if you look there, you'll see that the wire will go further apart, and then the wire will come closer together as the weight bounces up and down. That's, to some extent, what I'm imagining is taking place within the hydroton.
Now, there's a possibility that there's a cocktail of reactions going on in the system. There's the cold fusion Pons-Fleischmann heat mechanism that doesn't produce any radiation but produces heat commensurate with a D plus D reaction. Even though we're hypothesizing here a cluster, it's a cluster that eventually permits some kind of D plus D. We have that reaction, but then we also have other reactions that might be producing the neutrons, the energetic particles, and this includes stuff like fractofusion. So can you make a distinction between those two? And you touched on this a bit earlier, but maybe we can make it clearer because I think it's important.
That's right. There are a variety of reactions taking place. The major reaction producing the heat that people see is the fusion reaction involving the hydroton. But there are several other reactions that can produce different products, including neutrons, and one of them is called fractofusion. And this is well known, and that is if you create a crack, let's say you take a piece of lithium deuteride and you hit it with a hammer, you will get a burst of neutrons. And those bursts of neutrons occur because when the lattice is broken, it's split, a voltage is created across that gap, and the deuterons within that region are ionized and they are accelerated and they smash into each other with enough energy to produce a normal hot fusion reaction. And the normal hot fusion reaction produces tritium and neutrons, both of which can be detected, and they're both produced at equal amounts. That reaction has been studied. The neutrons and the tritium have been measured. We know that that reaction happens. So in order to make the gap that the hydroton will get into, some of the cracks will in fact produce a hot fusion reaction. And so you'll get a few neutrons, generally as bursts. The other problem is the transmutation reaction. Transmutation has the deuteron go into the nucleus of a heavier element, such as palladium. When that happens, that nucleus will frequently fission, will split, will break into two parts. And that reaction can really release neutrons on occasion. There's a variety of things that can take place which complicates the interpretation. And people have to be very careful when they interpret what is seen to make sure that they put what they're seeing in the right category.
We've already hit on a number of these, but maybe we can form a quick checklist for people. What do you think any theoretical model must acknowledge and account for in order for it to be considered a fundamentally sound framework? So what pieces of evidence do they need to be incorporated?
Well, the absolute essential is that the theory not conflict in any way with the laws of thermodynamics or with the laws of probability or with the laws of conservation of momentum. All of these laws have to be absolutely, without question, followed. And if they're not followed, that by itself is a reason to reject the idea. It doesn't matter what other clever ideas might be within the model. If it conflicts with basic known laws of nature, I would automatically reject it out of hand. The second thing is that it has to account for the major observations. It has to account for the production of helium, the production of tritium, and production of both of those without neutron of any significance and without energetic radiation of any significance. That's a serious problem. I mean, just being able to account for those basic observations is a serious challenge. And third, it has to somehow or another account for transmutation, because transmutation is real. It occurs at a much lower rate than does the fusion reaction, but the evidence now is overwhelming that it does in fact occur. And that's been the biggest challenge of present theory, because most theories have totally ignored that particular reaction, except mine. Mine, I make an effort to explain how transmutation takes place.
I guess from my reading of your material, I think a lot of the problems you have with other theories that they ignore a major piece. Something like heat-helium work, which is considered by many to be a standard in the field. There's some questions still surrounding it in a way, but if you're going to hang your hat on a piece of evidence in science, you're only going to get probabilities ultimately. There's no such thing as certainty. So when it comes to evidence, that seems to be a pretty good piece. And maybe we can just highlight that one real quick, because I think the heat-helium correlation, I talk with people about this sometimes, and it's a pretty important topic because there's no way around that evidence without suggesting some kind of nuclear reaction. And this is something that I think Huizenga said, if we found helium commensurate with heat, it would be a miracle. And scientists would be singing from the rooftops and praising it. And then we'd have to recognize cold fusion finally. And that was, I don't know, 92. And then Miles began showing it. Kubri proved it. Ania in Italy. There's many people. Murata. I think there's well over a dozen labs that have produced it over and over again. So can you just talk about the heat-helium work and the importance of that real quick?
There's 16 studies that have shown a relationship between helium production and heat production. That 16 includes 4 that have shown a qualitative relationship, actually a quantitative relationship. So we now know that the amount of energy and the number of atoms of helium are consistent with the fusion reaction, that is the DD fusion reaction, which is 23.8 MeV per helium. If you measure the heat and the number of atoms of helium, they are consistent with what you would expect based upon a DD fusion reaction. But then there are 16 others that show a clear correlation that when you have heat production, you have helium being produced. If you have no heat production, you have no helium being produced. So there's the evidence for helium being produced when you have deuterium present is now absolutely overwhelming. I mean, if this were any other field of science, people would not even be discussing it. It happens in the case of cold fusion. You have to be overwhelmingly certain of the data. Well, the data has gotten to that point now. Now, I might add, too, tritium also adds information about this process because you cannot make tritium any other way except by a nuclear reaction. And in the case of tritium, there are only a limited number of ways in which you can make tritium. And one of them, of course, is hot fusion, but if you do it that way, you get an equal number of neutrons. When people make tritium by the cold fusion technique, they have measured the neutrons, and the neutrons are down by a factor of 1 million from what you'd expect from the hot fusion reaction. So some very strange nuclear reaction is making tritium.
So it's possible we have something creating neutrons, something creating tritium, and something creating the excess heat, all side by side.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the case of cold fusion, there are no neutrons for all practical purposes. The number of neutrons is very, very small. I mean, people have seen them, but the rate is really, really trivial compared to the production rate of tritium and the production rate of helium.
With all the theories out there, you said earlier yourself that there is some overlap. So isn't it likely that a final theory, there'll be some compromise between what we currently know and also the competing theories of the time? Can any one theory be even close to correct at this juncture, or are we still groping in the dark a bit?
Well, that's the problem with these theories. There is a certain amount of overlap. There's a certain amount of similarity between the theories, and I address that in my book. You have to have some way of getting over the Coulomb barrier. So you propose a tunneling or a resonance or a vibration or something of that sort. That feature is present in a number of theories. You have to form a cluster. That requirement is present in all the theories. How the cluster is formed, however, is different in the different theories. And the problem with cluster formation within the lattice itself, that by itself conflicts with the laws of thermodynamics. So you have a situation really where there's no way of bringing, let's say, creating an average of the various concepts to arrive at a concept that is closer to the truth. You really have to throw everything out and start from scratch. And that's what I attempted to do. And that's what I advise anybody who is trying to do a better job than I did to do the same thing. Throw everything out, including my work, by the way, and start from scratch. Because you're not going to make any progress if you follow any of the present theories.
You know, lately I've been thinking about your work, and the analogy pops into my mind of Freeman-Dyson, where QED was in a state of pretty much disarray in I think it was the 40s or the 50s, I'm forgetting which, probably the 50s. Feynman had his model, Schwinger had his model, I think it was Takanori or something like that had his model, and other people were littered around, all have different ideas about how do we normalize the theory and make it sensical. And he came in and he was one of the few people that was able to survey all the work, bring it together and show either equivalence on certain things, discrepancies on others, and identified those three as having the major commonalities to form what we know of as quantum electrodynamics. So I think any theory requires that kind of synthesis at the end. And as you just suggested, other people have to come in and do kind of the same process. So your process, I think, is fundamentally correct in how all theory should be approached, in that, yeah, it's overwhelming to have to look at paper after paper and to distinguish something as small as the direction of radiation having a consequence on the theory. That's easy to miss. And that's one of those subtle things that your theory actually incorporates, which, again, even if it's not 100% correct, and no theory ever will be until, I don't know, hundreds of years, probably, at least it takes into account everything and tries to point in a sensible direction, because you always make the analogy to the map. We're digging for gold. If we're digging for gold, you have to make note of where gold has been looked for and not found. Yes, it's a gamble to abandon certain pieces of evidence or certain ideas, but moving forward or pursuing an idea, that's kind of necessary sometimes.
When you do this, I recommend that this is not for the faint of heart. There's probably 2,000 papers now that you would have to read. Many of these papers are in conference proceedings that are not easily accessed. Much of this information is not easily available simply because the conventional journals refuse to publish a lot of this information. So I'm lucky in that I have kept abreast of everything that has been discovered in the field. I have all of the books and conference proceedings, and have roughly 5,000 papers in my database that I can access very, very easily through the computer. So that makes it a lot easier for me, aside from the fact that I have the time to read all this. But if you're going to start from scratch, this is not an easy job.
Before we wrap up, do you have anything you want to leave us with? Any projects? Obviously, you just finished the book, so you probably don't have any new projects immediately on your horizon, but maybe you have some lab work that you're doing. And also maybe if you want to mention the work that Ruby Carrot of coldfusionnow.org had with your book.
Cold fusion is one of the most important discoveries of this century, and it offers the ideal energy source. It offers the opportunity to solve the global warming issue that is surrounding the production of CO2. It offers the solution to having to use nuclear power, which is most recently in Fukushima shown to be very dangerous. It has all of these benefits. The very strange thing about it is that it has been actively suppressed. It's been actively worked against by many people in government and in conventional science, in spite of the absolute critical need for such energy. The Japanese, on the other hand, I was told by one of the Japanese investigators many years ago, they said, look, we in Japan, we have no oil, we have no good source of energy. If cold fusion has a 1% chance of working, we'll study it. On the other hand, you in the United States, if cold fusion has a 1% chance of not working, you will not study it. And that's pretty much been the case. So somehow or another, the attitude of the general public, the attitude of science, the attitude of government has to change so that this absolutely incredible discovery can be applied and used to solve some of our critical problems. Ruby was very helpful. Ruby read the text and went over it very, very carefully, making it more readable, more understandable, forcing me to explain things that I thought were perfectly clear, but obviously were not. So she did a good job. And there were several other people that have read the book and provided those insights also. Tom Grimshaw, for example, also went through it very, very carefully and made some very good suggestions. That I very much appreciate.
Well, Ed, thank you again for your time today, and all the best of luck in your continued work and your continued writing. And I encourage everyone to get this book and read it. I've greatly enjoyed it. I think it's a tremendous contribution to the literature. Yes, there's a number of good books on cold fusion, but they're few in number, and there's none as thorough as this. And there's none as important in pointing into a direction of where to look, what is fruitful, what is still worth pursuing, and what should be looked at closer if we want to narrow the search a bit, because otherwise we're just kind of wandering a theory landscape. that we'll never escape from. So I guess we'll leave it at that, and thanks again, Ed, for your time.
Well, thank you very much, John. I enjoyed it.